Grace Whitfield had learned, over 4 years of working in the Ashford mansion, exactly how to disappear. She knew which floorboards in the east hallway creaked and which ones stayed silent. She knew to keep her eyes down when Mr. Ashford's guests swept past her in the foyer, trailing perfume and impatience. She knew the particular art of being present enough to do her job and invisible enough that no one ever had to acknowledge she existed. It was a skill that had kept her employed, kept her daughter fed, and kept the fragile piece of her life intact. What she hadn't planned for was a 3-year-old who refused to learn it. Lily had come to work with her that Tuesday because the sitter had canceled at the last minute, and Grace hadn't had the luxury of choice. She'd tucked her daughter into a corner of the laundry room with a coloring book and a promise of ice cream later, certain the girl would stay put for the 2 hours it would take to finish turning down the guest rooms before the evening's engagement dinner. Lily had other ideas. She always did. She was a small, fierce thing with her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn chin, and she had a habit of trailing after Grace from room to room like a curious shadow, unable to sit still when there was a whole beautiful house to explore. Grace had noticed it months ago and worried about it constantly. Lily didn't understand boundaries the way other children her age seemed to. She didn't understand that some people were meant to be looked at from a distance and others were meant to be avoided altogether. She said what she thought loudly and without apology, and Grace lived in a low hum of anxiety that one day her daughter's honesty would cost them both everything. That evening the house was already tense before the first guest arrived. Grace could feel it the way she could feel a storm coming, in the pressure behind her sternum, in the clipped way Mr. Ashford's assistant answered the phone. Daniel Ashford, the owner of the house and one of the wealthiest men in the state, was hosting an engagement celebration for himself and his fiancée, a woman named Vivian Calloway, and the entire staff had been reminded 3 times that everything needed to be perfect. Grace understood perfect. She had spent years perfecting the art of not being noticed, which in this house was its own kind of flawless. What none of the staff said out loud, though everyone seemed to feel it, was a quiet unease about Vivian herself. She was beautiful in the practiced, camera-ready way of someone who had spent a lifetime being looked at, and she smiled generously at Daniel, and at his friends and at anyone whose opinion mattered, but Grace had seen the other side of that smile. She had seen it 3 weeks earlier, when Vivian had caught her refolding a stack of towels in the linen closet and had, without any provocation at all, gripped Grace's wrist hard enough to bruise and hissed that she'd better stay out of her sight, unless she wanted to be unemployed by morning. Grace had said nothing. She never said anything. She had a daughter to feed and a landlord who didn't care about excuses, and women like her didn't get to have reactions to women like Vivian. The ballroom that night glittered with candlelight and crystal, filled with Daniel's business associates and Vivian's carefully curated circle of friends, everyone dressed like they'd stepped out of a magazine. Grace moved through the edges of it with a tray of champagne, keeping close to the walls, keeping her expression pleasant and blank. She had left Lily in the laundry room with strict instructions to stay, but children like Lily didn't stay anywhere for long, and by the time Grace noticed her daughter's absence, 20 minutes had already slipped by unnoticed in the chaos of service. She found her near the grand staircase, standing very still in her purple dress, watching something with the wide, unblinking focus only small children seem capable of. Grace's stomach dropped before she even understood why. She followed her daughter's gaze and saw Vivian standing a few feet away, cornering one of the younger caterers, speaking to her in a low, venomous voice that didn't match the practiced smile still fixed on her face for anyone watching from farther away. Grace couldn't make out the words, but she recognized the shape of the moment immediately, because she had lived it herself. She started forward, intending to scoop Lily up and vanish before anyone noticed either of them, but she wasn't fast enough. Vivian turned, saw Grace approaching, and something shifted behind her eyes, something sharp and cruel that only people who had been on the receiving end of it would ever recognize. "You," she said loud enough now to draw a few curious glances from nearby guests. "I told you to keep your daughter out of my sight." She said the word daughter like it was something distasteful, something that didn't belong in a house like this. Grace felt her face go hot with humiliation, the old familiar instinct to apologize. and shrink rising up in her before she could stop it. She opened her mouth to say something soothing, something that would make this stop, the way she always did. But before she could speak, Vivian took a step closer, her heel catching for just a moment on the edge of the marble, and in a motion that would later be argued about by witnesses as either an accident or entirely intentional. She reached out and shoved Grace hard in the chest. Grace stumbled backward and went down onto the marble floor, her dress crumpling around her, the champagne tray clattering out of her hands. The ballroom, which had been humming with conversation and laughter only seconds before, went suddenly, completely silent. Every head turned. Grace lay there for a moment stunned, more from the shock of being touched at all than from the fall itself, painfully aware of dozens of eyes on her, aware that this was the moment she had spent 4 years trying to avoid, the moment where she stopped being invisible. And then Lily moved. She crossed the space between them in a few quick, determined steps, planted herself directly in front of her mother, and pointed one small finger up at Vivian with an expression of pure, unshaken fury that looked strange and startling on such a young face. "Nobody hurts my mama," she said, her voice ringing out clear and high across the frozen ballroom, carrying to every corner of it in a way that no adult voice could have managed. "You're mean. I don't like you." For a moment nobody moved. Vivian's carefully maintained composure cracked, just slightly, a flash of something, ugly passing over her features, before she caught herself and forced her expression back into something resembling shock. "She fell," Vivian said quickly, looking around at the gathered guests. "I was trying to help her and she just fell. The poor thing must be exhausted." "You pushed her," Lily said, still standing her ground, still pointing, refusing to be talked over. The way adults so often assumed children could be. "I saw you. You're a liar." It was in that moment at the top of the staircase that Daniel Ashford appeared. He had come looking for his fiancée after noticing her missing from the main gathering, and he arrived at the top of the stairs in time to see the whole tableau below him. His housekeeper on the floor, his fiancée's face twisted into something he'd never seen before, and a small child standing between them like the only honest person in the room. He came down the stairs slowly, his expression unreadable, and Grace felt her heart drop into her stomach, certain that whatever happened next would end with her and Lily out on the street by morning. But Daniel didn't look at Grace, he looked at Vivian, and something in his face had changed, some final piece falling into place that Grace would only later understand had been building for weeks. He had been hearing things, small things, from other staff members too afraid to say them directly, whispers about Vivian's temper behind closed doors, about the way she spoke to people she considered beneath her. He had told himself it wasn't his business, that people had bad days, that he was imagining things. He couldn't tell himself that anymore, not with a 3-year-old's unflinching accusation still hanging in the air, and not with the memory of that flash of ugliness that had crossed Vivian's face before she'd composed herself. He crouched down instead in front of Grace, offering his hand to help her up, his voice quiet enough that only she and Lily could hear it. "Are you all right?" he asked, and there was something in the question that felt different from the polite, distant way he usually addressed the staff, something that felt like he was actually asking, actually waiting to hear the answer. Grace, too stunned to do anything but nod, let him help her to her feet, very aware of Lily's small hand slipping into hers, gripping tight. Daniel turned to Vivian then, and though his voice stayed measured and low, every person in that ballroom could feel the temperature of the room shift. He told her in front of everyone that he'd need her to leave. Vivian's face went through several expressions in quick succession, disbelief, fury, and finally a kind of desperate pleading, insisting this was a misunderstanding, that Grace had exaggerated, that surely he wasn't going to take the word of the help over hers. Daniel's answer was quiet and final. He said he wasn't taking anyone's word for anything. He'd watched it happen with his own eyes, and more than that, he'd just watched a child, brave enough to tell the truth in a room, full of adults too polite to say anything at all. He said that was worth more to him than anything Vivian could offer. The party did not continue as planned that night. Guests trickled out in awkward, murmuring clusters, and Vivian left through the front doors with her coat clutched around her shoulders, refusing to look at anyone on her way out. Grace stood in the sudden quiet of the emptying ballroom, still holding Lily's hand, still trying to understand what exactly had just happened to the careful, invisible life she'd built for the two of them. Daniel found her in the kitchen an hour later, after the last of the staff had finished cleaning and gone home, Lily asleep now against Grace's shoulder, worn out from the excitement of an evening far too big for her small body. He didn't say much at first. He just sat down across from her at the little staff table where Grace usually ate her lunch alone, and he told her he was sorry. Not for the party, not for Vivian's behavior specifically, but for 4 years of not really looking at the people who kept his house running, of not knowing until tonight that one of them was raising a daughter this brave and this good on wages that probably weren't enough for either of them. He asked carefully, without any of the performative concern she'd learned to distrust from wealthy people, what it would take to make things right. Not tonight, not as an apology gift, but going forward. Better pay. A better position if she wanted it. Somewhere she wouldn't have to disappear into the walls to survive. Grace, still holding her sleeping daughter, found she didn't have the energy left to be suspicious of kindness, not after everything the night had already taken out of her. In the weeks that followed, things did change slowly and then all at once. Grace was offered a position managing the household staff directly, work that came with a real salary and a real title, and more importantly, the ability to stop flinching every time someone with more money than her walked into a room. Daniel made a point in small, consistent ways of treating the people in his home like people, checking in, remembering names, noticing things he'd spent years training himself not to see. It wasn't a fairy tale transformation. It was slower and more human than that, built one ordinary Tuesday at a time. Lily never fully understood what she'd done that night, not in any grand sense. To her, it had simply been obvious that someone hurting her mother was wrong, and that someone needed to say so. She didn't know that her small, furious voice had cracked open a room full of adults who'd spent the evening, too polite or too afraid, to say what she'd said without hesitation. She just knew months later that her mama laughed more now, that the house didn't feel so cold anymore, and that sometimes, when Mr. Ashford came by to check on the two of them, he brought her a coloring book and always let her pick the colors first. Grace watched her daughter grow braver every day after that, no longer teaching her to disappear the way she'd once tried to, but instead learning something new herself, something about how honesty, even from the smallest and most unlikely of voices, had a way of changing everything it touched.